He tore his pregnant ex-wife's dress in front of everyone, but her next move ruined his entire wedding. The church doors groaned open, and a cold wind slipped inside, carrying whispers sharper than any blade. Lady Eleanor Hargrave paused beneath the archway, one hand resting on her swollen belly, and realized far too late that she had not been summoned here for her inheritance at all. No, the man who had once vowed to cherish her had lured her into his wedding, a wedding to another woman. And as the candlelight flickered across curious faces, Eleanor understood with a sinking, icy certainty that whatever humiliation Lord Benedict Ashford planned for her, he meant for the entire congregation to witness it. Hello, my dear. If this unfolding tale of betrayal, dignity, and a woman's rise from ruin pulls you in already, tap like, drop a quick comment, and subscribe so YouTube knows to bring you more stories you'll love. And if you don't mind, tell me your first name in the comments. I read every single one, and it truly warms my heart. The bells of Street Aldwyns tolled with a solemnity that did not belong to weddings. Their heavy bronze tongues struck the winter air with a slow, deliberate sorrow, as though the church itself sensed something amiss. The guests, wrapped in furs and silks, shuffled through the wide arched doorway, murmuring about the bride's diamonds, the groom's title, the weather, anything but the truth that hung unspoken among them. Lord Benedict Ashford was remarrying, and his former wife, Lady Eleanor Hargrave, was standing at the very threshold of the same church from which she had been quietly exiled just 1 year earlier. Her hand rested upon the small of her back, not for comfort, but for balance. The child she carried shifted within her, a gentle reminder that she was no longer entirely alone. Her cloak was simple compared to the finery around her, but her posture held a quiet authority that no amount of gossip could strip away. She had come because Benedict's solicitor insisted her presence was necessary to sign the final papers concerning her late mother's inheritance documents Benedict had withheld for months. Just a few signatures, the letter claimed, and it shall all be concluded. No mention of the wedding, no warning of the scene she was walking into. It was only when she stepped onto the church steps and heard the murmurs, "Is that her? She came, in her condition," that the truth clenched around her like a cold fist. A footman rushed forward to stop her, but it was too late. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and a wave of warm incense escaped, mingling with the frigid morning air. And there, at the far end of the aisle, framed by candles and white roses, Benedict turned. His expression tightened the moment he saw her. It was not shock, not regret, but irritation, as though she were an unwelcome guest at his celebration, rather than the woman who had once worn his ring. The new bride, Miss Cressida Vale, stiffened at Eleanor's appearance. Her pale gloved hand tightened around her bouquet, but she did not turn away. Instead, she watched, rigid and alert, as Benedict descended the aisle toward his former wife. Eleanor lifted her chin. If he wished to shame her, she would not give him the dignity of witnessing her tremble. "Eleanor," his voice was low, strained, "you should not be here." "I was summoned," she replied evenly, "by your solicitor." "My," his jaw clenched. "He was instructed to handle the matter discreetly, not to parade you before my guests." "Then perhaps," she said calmly, "you should have clarified whether the fault lies in my presence or your embarrassment." A few nearby guests gasped at her poise. Others leaned in, eager for spectacle. Benedict stepped closer. Too close. Close enough for her to smell the familiar winter scent of his cologne, oak, bergamot, and something sharper beneath. The scent that once made her heart flutter now felt like a warning. "What game are you playing, Eleanor?" His voice was a hiss. You think appearing like this fatigued, swollen, will stir sympathy? Her gaze remained steady. There is nothing to stir. I seek only what is mine. His eyes flicked down to her abdomen. Yours or someone else's? There it was, the dagger. The rumour he had allowed to grow unchecked. The whisper that her child was a shameful secret rather than a rightful heir. She did not flinch. The child is none of your concern. That was the wrong thing to say, and she knew it the moment the words left her lips. For Benedict's pride, not his heart. Never. His heart was a fragile structure held together by the approval of others. And the subtle amusement on the faces around them struck at him like needles. You dare, he whispered. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, his hand shot out. His fingers gripped the neckline of her dress. Fabric gathered in his fist. Gasps flew like startled birds. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her palm instinctively protecting her stomach. Benedict, she murmured warningly. But the man she once loved was long gone, replaced by the echo of every slight he believed she had caused him. With a sudden sharp pull, one driven by humiliation rather than strength, he tore the front of her dress. The sound was obscene in its simplicity, a harsh, helpless rip that seemed to echo off the church walls. Her cloak slipped, lace shredded. Her dress gaped open at the shoulder, bearing skin that should never have been exposed in public. The bride gasped. Women turned away. Men whispered behind gloved hands. A scandal, a spectacle, the very thing society devoured with monstrous appetite. But Eleanor did not cry. She stood perfectly still, her breath a steady line of frost in the cold air. Her hand remained firmly on her stomach, shielding the life within her. Slowly, very slowly, she lifted her eyes to the man she had once trusted. There was no rage in her expression, no despair, no desperation, only clarity. You have just destroyed the last piece of mercy I carried for you, she said quietly. And in doing so, you have given me exactly what I needed. Benedict faltered. What are you talking about? She stepped forward, the torn fabric whispering around her. For a moment, the entire congregation held its breath. Even the bride seemed frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Eleanor leaned in close enough for only Benedict to hear. You have freed me, she murmured, and now I shall return the favour. Before he could respond, she turned her back to him gracefully, almost regally, and began walking down the aisle. Even with the torn dress, her steps were steady, her spine unyielding. People parted before her, as though she were a queen rather than a disgraced woman. And with every step she took, their whispers softened, shifting from scandal to something more uncertain, something resembling respect. As she reached the doorway, a sudden gust swept into the church, extinguishing the nearest candles. A flicker of darkness crossed the sanctuary, brief but unmistakable, a sign, an omen, or perhaps simply the echo of a storm that had long been brewing. Eleanor paused at the threshold, one hand on the wooden door. She did not look back, not at Benedict, not at the bride, not at the audience she had just stunned into silence. Now, she whispered to herself, and to the child within her, we begin. And then she stepped into the cold winter light, disappearing into a new chapter of her life, one Benedict would come to regret far more than he could yet imagine. The snow had begun to fall by the time Eleanor reached her carriage. The flakes were soft and methodical, drifting through the air like tiny white truths settling upon the world. She drew her cloak tighter across her torn dress, breathing slowly until the tremor in her hand quieted. The coachman opened the door for her, but paused, eyes widening at the damage to her gown. My lady, shall I fetch assistance? No, she replied softly. Please take me home." As the carriage lurched forward, she let her palm rest on her stomach. The child shifted gently, as though sensing the storm around them. "You and I," she whispered, "will not be broken by him." Through the frost-laced window, the church grew smaller, until it disappeared entirely behind the veil of snow. And with that, her mind slipped back into the past, back to the moment everything had first begun. It was a mild spring afternoon, 3 years earlier, when she first met Benedict. Most romantic stories began at balls or soirees, under chandeliers and string quartets. But Eleanor had never been particularly fond of society's noisy rituals. She preferred quiet corners, botanical gardens, and the fragrance of things that grew in silence. She had been in the conservatory of the Hargrave estate, studying the delicate veins of a white camellia leaf, when she heard footsteps behind her. "Those flowers are notoriously difficult to keep from bruising," a warm voice said. She turned, and there he was, Lord Benedict Ashford, golden-haired, impeccably tailored, a man whose presence seemed to warm the very air around him. Everything about him looked effortless, from the way he held his gloves, to the gentle smile resting on his lips. Eleanor had not fallen easily, but she had fallen nonetheless. In those early days, he seemed charmed by her mind rather than her status. He listened when she spoke, asked questions that showed genuine interest, and admired her independence in a society that offered little for women to claim as their own. He walked with her through the gardens, wrote her letters filled with poetry, and told her she was unlike any woman he had ever known. Looking back now, Eleanor realized she had mistaken intensity for sincerity. Their marriage began gracefully enough. The Ashford estate, though aging, was grand and elegant, surrounded by ancient oaks and fields stretching toward the horizon. But beneath its beauty lay an unsettling truth, one Eleanor discovered piece by piece. The estate's finances were in ruin. Benedict's father had gambled away generations of wealth. His mother was long dead, leaving no dowry behind, and the Ashford name, so revered by society, was held together by little more than the illusion of prosperity. Eleanor never judged him for these struggles. She offered help. Her inheritance was to be substantial. Her late mother had been wise and cautious, creating trusts and accounts that no man, not even a husband, could touch without her consent. But Benedict's pride was brittle. "I don't want to be a charity case," he had once said sharply. "I will restore my family name without your money." She remembered the sting of that moment clearly, the way he turned from her, ashamed yet angry, burdened by a legacy he did not choose but desperately tried to uphold. And then came Cressida Vale. Cressida had been a distant cousin of the Ashfords, raised with a sharp tongue and a sharper ambition. She was elegant, intelligent, and entirely lacking in conscience. She arrived as a guest, but her presence lingered far longer than politeness required. Eleanor sensed the shift almost immediately. Cressida's eyes followed Benedict with a familiarity that unsettled her, and Benedict, frustrated by estate troubles, found comfort in anyone who praised him, soothed him, or whispered reassurances that fed his fragile pride. Still, Eleanor tried to be patient. She believed marriage required steadiness, during storms especially. But the storm that was coming would sweep their entire world away. It began with letters. A maid handed Eleanor a note one afternoon unsigned, written in a hurried hand. "He meets her in the lower gardens. He tells her things meant for you." Eleanor wanted to dismiss it as malicious gossip, yet something inside her urged caution. The second letter came 2 days later. "He speaks of debts. He seeks a way to release himself from certain obligations." Obligations? Her inheritance? Their marriage? A week later, she overheard Benedict and Cressida in the study. "I cannot tolerate her any longer," Benedict said. his voice strained. "She questions me at every turn, undermines my decisions, and refuses to trust me." "Because you've allowed her to dictate the estate," Cressida replied coolly. "She has money, Benedict. You have a name, but which of you holds the power? The county whispers about it. They say she married you for title. They say you cling to her wealth. Does that not humiliate you?" Eleanor froze at the doorway. Cressida continued, her voice sweetly venomous. "There are ways to free yourself, if you had the courage. Ways to restore your honor." Eleanor never heard his answer. At that moment, her own pulse drowned out the world. She stepped away silently, but the echo of their words carved themselves into her heart. When the scandal emerged weeks later, it was nearly perfect in its execution. A rumor spread through the county. Eleanor had been seen in the company of a man at the riverbank. A fabricated witness, a bribed footman, a forged letter suggesting impropriety. It struck at the heart of Victorian morality. Women were fragile glass. A single crack meant ruin. Benedict confronted her, letter in hand, disbelief curdling into fury. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "Is it his child?" She had been too stunned to speak, not because of the accusation, but because she realized he wanted the betrayal to be true. It justified everything he had been feeling. It freed him. "Benedict," she whispered, "how could you believe this?" His silence was answer enough. Within a month, she was exiled from the estate, quietly, strategically, publicly painted as unstable, unfaithful, unworthy of her title. The world turned cold overnight. She learned she was with child the day she left Ashford Hall, alone, heartbroken, holding the proof of his love inside her while carrying the lash marks of his mistrust. And she vowed two things. First, she would protect her child from the Ashford cruelty. Second, she would uncover the truth behind the betrayal. Piece by piece, she gathered evidence. Letters whose handwriting didn't match, servants who suddenly had more money than they should, Cressida's frequent visits to Benedict's study, and financial ledgers that revealed Benedict had arranged loans under Eleanor's name without her consent. He had not only betrayed her, he had used her. Now, sitting in the swaying carriage, after the dress-tearing humiliation, Eleanor felt none of the weakness she once had. Only clarity, only resolve. "Your father will know who he is," she whispered to her unborn child, "but he will never own him, and he will never own me again." The carriage rode on through the snow. Eleanor did not shed a single tear. Her revenge had already begun. London receives Eleanor, not as a fallen woman, but as a whisper, one of those quiet curiosities that flourished in Victorian drawing rooms, where rumours travelled faster than trains. The city, smothered in fog and ambition, becomes the landscape of her rebirth. She arrives at dusk, stepping out of a modest hired carriage, before a townhouse owned by the widowed Duchess of Pennington. The Duchess, a woman of 60, with silver hair coiled neatly like a crown she no longer cared to display, had once endured the same cruelty Eleanor now faced. Society had discarded her for grieving too loudly, for refusing to remarry, for quietly purchasing half the failing estates of the very families who mocked her, a formidable ally. She welcomes Eleanor without pity, simply saying, "People forget that women grow sharper, not softer, when wounded." The two form an unlikely bond, not friendship, not yet, but something older, survival through intelligence. The Duchess teaches Eleanor the two forms of Victorian power women could wield without being burned by society, reputation, and information. Everything else came second. Eleanor studies ledgers by candlelight, her hands resting protectively over her unborn child, as she learns more about the Ashford estates than Benedict himself had ever cared to know. She discovers unpaid debts hidden beneath elegant soirees, land boundaries contested but suppressed, and a mortgage on the northern estate that, if revealed, would brand the Ashfords as financially unstable, a cardinal sin in aristocratic England. But she is not reckless. She does not rush. Revenge, she learns, is a slow craft. She begins attending small gatherings, hosted by the Duchess rooms, filled not with aristocrats, but with those who enabled them, solicitors, land agents, elderly widows who knew every family secret, young barristers hungry for advancement. Eleanor listens more than she speaks. She observes the rhythm of influence, the subtle hierarchies, the way men underestimated a woman with a soft voice and a calm face. Among these men is Mr. Frederick Alton, a respected solicitor in his early 40s, known for integrity rather than ambition. He notices Eleanor's quiet resilience. He offers legal insight, not out of favour, but respect. He explains the inheritance laws that shielded Benedict, the loopholes that could either entrap him or free her, and the most dangerous truth of all: her child, if acknowledged, would inherit everything. It would obliterate Benedict's new marriage. It would tear apart the carefully constructed facade he had built. It would place Eleanor, unwillingly, back into the very world that chewed her up. But Eleanor does not seek reinstatement. She seeks restoration. She wants dignity returned. She wants the truth witnessed. She wants a future not anchored to a man's name. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bramblehurst, a discreet columnist for the London Gazette, starts visiting. Her interest is not gossip, but patterns how scandals rise, who benefits from them, how stories shape reputations more swiftly than any legal decree. She becomes Eleanor's subtle voice, seeding carefully chosen whispers into society. Nothing damning, nothing untrue, only enough to make London wonder if the Ashfords' perfect image was beginning to crack. Then one afternoon, as Eleanor leaves the Duchess's townhouse after a lengthy meeting, she encounters a man she has not seen in years. Captain Jonathan Hargrave, her late brother's closest friend. His return from Bengal has etched experience into his features, silver at the temples, a faint scar across his cheek, a weariness, not of weakness, but of someone who has lived through the world's harshest truths. Jonathan recognizes her immediately, his expression shock, sorrow, anger, on her behalf, cuts through her composure more deeply than any confrontation with Benedict ever could. "Eleanor, what have they done to you?" His voice carries a reverence she had not heard in years. Jonathan is not a man of florid speeches. His affection is shown through actions, escorting her across busy roads, sending her books on estate management, never asking intrusive questions. His presence steadies her, not a rescue, not romance, not yet, but companionship, the rare kind that grows from shared history and tragedy. In him, Eleanor finds the one thing she thought she no longer deserved: kindness without motive. As months pass, her child grows, her resolve strengthens. London begins to notice the quiet rise of Lady Eleanor Hargrave, not the disgraced wife, but the woman who moves in influential rooms with dignity and restraint. She becomes the centre of a small, silent storm forming around the Ashfords. Not a single blow is struck directly, not a single public accusation, yet rumours begin to swirl like fog around Benedict's name debts, inconsistencies, whispers of cruelty. Eleanor says nothing, always dignified, always strategic, but she is preparing for the confrontation that will decide everything: her child's future, her own freedom, Benedict's downfall, and the unexpected beginnings of a new. Winter comes early that year. London is swallowed by a silver fog that clings to gas lamps and softens the city's sharp edges. It is in this muted, almost reverent atmosphere, that Eleanor sets the final pieces of her strategy into motion. Her revenge does not resemble revenge at all. To the untrained eye, it looks like paperwork. Conversations over tea, calm meetings behind closed oak doors, and quiet visits to barristers who speak in low, deliberate voices. But beneath that calm veneer lies a tremor that will soon shake the Ashford name to its foundations. Her solicitor, Mr. Frederick Alton, compiles the physical evidence, the forged signatures that removed her access to marital assets, the accounting irregularities, the payment to the witness who falsely testified against her, and the secret mortgage on the northern estate, concealed behind a third-party bank to avoid public record. None of these discoveries are shared with society. Eleanor's revenge is born of intellect, not spectacle. Instead, the documents travel through quieter corridors, to a member of Parliament with a vested interest in exposing corrupt aristocratic dealings, to a private judicial clerk whose discretion is impeccable, and finally, to Mrs. Bramblehurst, the journalist who knows how to wield truth like a scalpel rather than a hammer. She writes a story unlike any gossip column. No insults, no sensationalism, no emotional language, just facts, cold, polished, irrefutable facts. The Ashford family's financial misconduct, the deception surrounding Eleanor's expulsion, the forged evidence used against her, the unlawful mortgage, the fraudulent legal maneuvers. In an era where reputation is currency, a calm truth is more devastating than a shouted accusation. The article appears not in a tabloid, but in a serious political journal read by barristers, magistrates, and the upper echelons of Parliament. Within hours, London's drawing rooms hum like a hive struck by a cane. But the true blow comes at the Pennington Winter Gala, a glittering event attended by aristocrats, ambassadors, and foreign dignitaries. Eleanor arrives not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman reborn. Her gown is elegant but understated, her posture straight, her expression composed. Jonathan Hargrave stands discreetly near her, never overshadowing her, never claiming space that is not his. His presence is a quiet assurance. She is no longer alone in the world. The murmurs begin the moment she steps into the ballroom. Pages of the journal circulate discreetly, from gloved hand to gloved hand. No one dares approach her at first. Respect, sudden and reluctant, ripples through the crowd. Then Benedict arrives. He looks older, harsher, a man who has heard the first crack of his world breaking and does not know how deep the fissure runs. His new bride, pale and trembling, arrives moments later with her mother in tow. She avoids Benedict's gaze entirely. Even from a distance, one can see something has come undone. Her posture rigid, her expression wounded and furious. She has read the article. She has realized what she married into. When the Ashfords attempt to approach Eleanor, they find her surrounded by quiet power. The Duchess of Pennington, Jonathan, several senior advisers, and even a known member of Parliament. Not a protective circle, but a circle of respect. The Ashfords are made to wait, just long enough for the room to register the change in status. Finally, Eleanor nods, allowing Benedict to step forward. His voice trembles, the confidence he once possessed reduced to dust. "Eleanor, did you do this?" She meets his gaze with an expression so calm that it unsettles him more than fury ever could. "I simply revealed the truth," she replies. "Nothing more." He tries to speak again, but another blow lands. His new bride steps aside, her voice cold and public. "I cannot remain tied to a man who would ruin an innocent woman for convenience." Gasps, whispers, a collective shift of the ballroom's atmosphere. Benedict stares at the floor, trapped in the very humiliation he once tried to inflict on Eleanor. Investors pull out within days. A creditor arrives at the estate with legal papers. The northern property is announced for auction. Parliament whispers of a formal investigation. The Ashford legacy, once gilded with pride, begins to crumble. And then Benedict does something Eleanor never anticipated. He seeks her out in private, not to accuse, but to beg. There is no rage in him, only the hollow, desperate look of a man who finally understands the weight of what he has lost. "Eleanor," he whispers, "I was misled, manipulated. I made mistakes, but I did love you once. Please, say there is something left in you that can forgive me." She studies him for a long, quiet moment. The room is still. Even her unborn child seems to rest in silence. Then she speaks softly, clearly. "You taught me the value of humiliation. I simply returned it to you in its original form. You may rebuild your life, but you will not rebuild it with me. No anger, no theatrics, just closure." Jonathan finds her shortly after, offering no praise, no commentary, only his steady presence. They walk out into the winter night as equals, the cold air crisp with possibility. And Eleanor feels something she has not felt since the conservatory where she first fell in love years ago. Freedom. Spring arrived in London without ceremony that year. No riot of blooms, no jubilant skies, only a gentle softening. The frost receded, the air eased. And in the quiet garden behind the residence, Eleanor now called home. The first pale shoots of wisteria curled shyly along the stone wall, awakening after a long, punishing winter. Eleanor often stood at the window to watch them. She liked their quiet determination, how they grew without spectacle, how they climbed without asking permission. Much like she herself, she thought. The labour had been long and wearying, but when her son was finally placed in her arms 4 nights earlier, the pain of everything, the wedding, the scandal, the lies, the exile, seemed to loosen its grip. His small face, round and serene, carried nothing of the world's cruelty. "Arthur," she whispered that first night, in the dim candle glow, a name that felt like promise, like renewal. Arthur Hargrave. Her child, her legacy, no title attached, no estate demanded, no Ashford obligations. Just a life she would build with deliberate, gentle hands. On the morning of his 5th day, the household was warm with quiet excitement. Mrs. Merrow, the widowed Duchess, who had taken Eleanor under her wing, insisted on preparing a special broth herself. Thomas Fielding, the solicitor who had stood loyally by Eleanor during the unravelling of Benedict's deceit, arrived with flowers and documents he refused to let her sign until she had fully rested. And Jonathan Hargrave came, not with gifts, but with presents. He never knocked loudly, never entered abruptly. He waited in the corridor until Mrs. Merrow nodded him in, always respecting Eleanor's space as though it were sacred. When he stepped into her room now, she felt her heart shift in the familiar, unsettling way it had begun to whenever he appeared. "May I?" he said, glancing at the cradle. Eleanor nodded. Jonathan moved with surprising gentleness for a man who had spent years in colonial outposts, fighting both weather and conflict. His broad hands, usually steady and scarred, trembled slightly as he lifted the baby. "He looks like your brother," Jonathan murmured. Around the eyes, a soft pain curled at the edge of Eleanor's chest. Grief, gratitude, memory entwined. "He would have adored him," she whispered. Jonathan's eyes warmed. "I already do." There was no rush in his voice, no expectation. Just sincerity, patient, unpolished, real. The kind of affection that grew like the wisteria outside, slowly, steadily, without demand. When he returned the child to the cradle, Eleanor noticed the exhaustion in his shoulders. The last months had been brutal for him as well, though he rarely spoke of his own wounds. He had faced Parliament inquiries, testified in her defence, overseen legal transfers, and protected her name when society hungered for scandal. "You look tired," she said softly. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Rest comes easier now that the worst has passed." Yes, the worst. The final blow to Benedict's world had unfolded weeks earlier, not with shouting, not with drama, but with the quiet devastation of truth laid bare in public record. His bride had fled back to her family. Creditors swarmed Ashford Hall. The estate, shrunken and burdened, went under trusteeship, and Benedict, stripped of dignity, influence, and every illusion of control, had left England with nothing but bitterness trailing behind him like a tattered cloak. Eleanor had felt no triumph, only completion. A chapter closed. Justice, not cruelty. Balance restored, not vengeance indulged. And through it all, Jonathan remained at her side, like a steady compass, never intrusive, never possessive, just steady. As she watched him now, standing near the window, with the newborn's soft breaths filling the room, she felt a stirring of something she had not trusted in a long time. Hope, not for justice, she had already achieved that. Not for power, she had built that herself, but for companionship, for gentleness, for love, uncoiled slowly and quietly, like a flower opening after surviving a storm. "Walk with me?" Jonathan asked, noticing her gaze drifting toward the garden. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Mrs. Merrow eagerly took the child, cooing as though she had waited all morning for the privilege. Eleanor wrapped her shawl across her shoulders. Jonathan offered his arm, but not out of duty, out of regard. She accepted, not because she needed support, but because she wanted the connection. They stepped into the garden. The wisteria vines trembled lightly in the early breeze. The stone path was warmed by a timid sun. Somewhere beyond the wall, a church bell chimed, not like the heavy, mournful bells on the day of the wedding, but a lighter, gentler peal that spoke of ordinary life, unburdened by spectacle. "It's peaceful here," Jonathan said. "It is," Eleanor replied, for the first time in a long while. He turned slightly. "You have built something remarkable, Eleanor." She looked down at her hands, remembering how unsteady they had once felt. "I have built only what I needed to survive." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You built a refuge for yourself, for your child, for women who have been forgotten or discarded. You turned suffering into structure, pain into purpose. Not many could have done that." Her throat tightened. Praise from him always felt heavier, not flattery, but truth spoken plainly. She met his eyes. "And what have you built, Jonathan?" He held her gaze with a softness that threatened to unmoor her. A reason to stay. The silence that followed was warm, not uncertain. She felt it settling between them, not demanding an answer, only welcoming one when she was ready. "I am not prepared for anything." "Swift," she said quietly. "Then we will take no swift steps," he replied. "Not one. I am patient, and I am here. That is enough for now." She nodded, a small exhale leaving her chest like a weight drifting away. They resumed their walk, slowly, side by side, no urgency in their pace. Just two people who had survived enough to understand the value of gentleness. When they reached the far end of the garden, Eleanor paused to look back at the house, her house where her son slept peacefully in a room filled with warmth, not fear. "My life," she murmured, "feels like something I recognize again." Jonathan smiled. "Your life is finally yours." "Yes," she whispered, "finally." And with spring unfolding around them, with quiet peace settling over the home she had crafted from ashes, Eleanor knew she had not won against Benedict. She had simply won herself back. And that victory, simple and profound, was the beginning of a new story, one written not in bitterness, but in bloom. If this story gave you a smile or a sigh, tap like, leave a quick comment, and subscribe, so YouTube knows to bring you more stories you'll enjoy.